Two men in military uniforms walked up to a group of Basij militiamen on Fakhuri Boulevard in Mashhad, raised handguns, and opened fire at close range. One militiaman died on the street. A second died, later in the hospital. The gunman ran. Nobody has been caught. This happened during the funeral procession for Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader killed by American and Israeli strikes back in February, in the middle of 6 days of national mourning that security forces had locked down with metal detectors, body searches, and a complete closure of Tehran's airspace. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange. The first outlet to report the killings was Saberine News, a media operation directly affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard itself. And within hours, a second outlet, Fars News, also affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, flatly denied it. They called it a false rumor spread by anti-revolutionary elements, and claimed a security check had found no evidence any unusual incident occurred at all, not near the shrine, not along the funeral route. So which is it? Did gunmen execute two Basij militiamen in broad daylight during the most sensitive week of mourning the Islamic Republic has staged in decades? Or did that never happen at all? The fact that Iran's own state-aligned propaganda apparatus can't agree with itself on whether a shooting happened tells you something far more important than the shooting itself, and I want to walk you through exactly why. Because this one confusing local story connects directly to almost everything else that's been destabilizing Iran from the inside this entire year. Let's set the scene properly, because the context here is what makes this genuinely significant rather than just one confusing local news item lost in the noise of a bigger war. Khamenei's funeral began on July 4th, deliberately, according to several observers, on the 250th anniversary of American independence, though Iranian authorities never officially acknowledged the timing themselves. Crowds at the opening ceremony chanted "Death to America" anyway, a refrain that's been standard at Iranian state functions since the 1979 revolution. But one that carried unusual weight this time because Khamenei wasn't dying of old age in his own bed, surrounded by a peaceful, orderly transition of power the way his own predecessor, Ruhollah Khomeini, had been decades earlier. He was killed in the opening airstrike of the war on February 28th, alongside 4 members of his own family, their caskets displayed beneath his at the funeral, his identified by the black turban marking him as a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. His son, Mujtaba, was elevated to supreme leader in the aftermath, reportedly wounded in that same attack. And in the more than 4 months between his father's death and this funeral, Mujtaba Khamenei has not appeared in public a single time, not once. No video address, no audio message, nothing. Iran's brand new supreme leader is, as far as the outside world can tell, a man nobody has actually seen lead anything, and even his funeral appearance remained genuinely uncertain right up until the ceremonies began. Security around this funeral was extraordinary, and for very specific, publicly stated reasons. Israel's own defense minister, Israel Katz, said just days before the ceremonies began that Mujtaba Khamenei was, in his exact words, marked for death. The Revolutionary Guard responded with a direct warning of its own, declaring that any miscalculation would be met with a decisive and more crushing response than ever before. Language, they said, would be forever recorded in what they called their enemies' shameful history. Iran shut down Tehran's entire airspace for the procession, its civil aviation organization announcing the closure days in advance. Officials specifically cited concern about drone attacks, and the deputy governor for political and security affairs later confirmed publicly that air defenses had achieved what he called a timely response, intercepting enemy drones attempting to target the event before they could strike. Millions of mourners were expected to gather in dense crowds across multiple cities over 6 full days of ceremonies, moving from Tehran to the holy city of Qom, and finally toward burial. Any successful attack on a crowd that size could have killed thousands. Every senior Iranian official who showed his face in public that week, including the IRGC's own commander-in-chief, Ahmad Vahidi, a man who himself only holds that position because his predecessor, Mohammad Pakpour, was killed in the war's opening strikes, was taking a personal, calculated risk simply by attending. Vahidi had not been seen publicly for months before making what CNN described as a rare appearance, photographed sitting beside Khamenei's casket. A striking image, given that several of his own predecessors leading the Revolutionary Guard's most elite units, including the widely known assassination of Qasem Soleimani years earlier, had themselves been killed by American or Israeli operations. Now overlay all of that tension onto what was happening simultaneously, away from the cameras in Tehran. This funeral wasn't happening during peacetime. It was happening in the exact same week that a fragile ceasefire between Iran and the United States was actively collapsing in real time. Just days before the funeral began, the United States launched 2 consecutive nights of the heaviest strikes since that ceasefire was signed back in mid-June, close to 90 separate targets in a single night, hitting cities across Iran's entire southern coastline, from Bandar Abbas to Bushehr to Chabahar. Iran's own health ministry said the latest wave alone killed 14 people and injured 78 more. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Iran's own chief negotiator with Washington, posted a defiant warning on social media in the middle of the funeral proceedings, telling America that bullying and breaking its commitments no longer comes without a cost, warning that if you strike, you'll be struck, and insisting that the Strait of Hormuz would reopen only under Iranian arrangements, never American threats. Fellow parliamentarian Alaeddin Boroujerdi told state broadcaster IRIB that Iran's response would be more severe, warning that continued confrontation would ultimately harm the United States far more than Iran. Hardline lawmakers were publicly demanding Iran abandon the ceasefire framework with Washington entirely. Diplomatic talks that had been quietly underway in Doha, Qatar, were paused specifically because of the funeral, according to CNN's own reporting, with Ghalibaf himself acknowledging that implementing the ceasefire his country had signed was, in his words, difficult but achievable, hardly a ringing endorsement of confidence in the process. This is the atmosphere the funeral was unfolding inside, a regime simultaneously trying to project the image of overwhelming national unity around its dead supreme leader. While its negotiators were openly threatening the United States, while its military was absorbing fresh casualties along its coastline, and while, if Sabrine news is to be believed, someone was walking up to armed regime loyalists on a public street in one of Iran's holiest cities and shooting them dead. That's not a coincidence of bad timing. That's a regime under simultaneous pressure from at least 4 completely separate directions at once: external war, internal legitimacy, economic collapse, and now, potentially, targeted domestic violence against its own loyalist base. And it's worth understanding each of those pressures individually before we come back to what the Mashhad shooting actually means, sitting at the center of all of them. Start with the economic pressure, because it's the pressure that touches the most ordinary Iranians directly, and it's the pressure that arguably explains everything else that follows. Iran's economy going into this funeral week was not simply strained by decades of sanctions. It was actively being squeezed on multiple fronts simultaneously by American military action. Just days before the strikes on Iran's southern coast, the Trump administration reimposed oil sanctions that had been suspended for 60 days as part of the original ceasefire agreement. One of the only tangible economic benefits Iran had received from agreeing to that truce in the first place. That sanctions relief, gone in an instant, in direct retaliation for Iranian attacks on shipping. Simultaneously, American cruise missiles struck a railway bridge in Iran's northeast, a rare deliberate strike on infrastructure rather than purely military targets, specifically targeting a rail corridor connecting Iran to Central Asia and onward to its 2 most important remaining economic partners, China and Russia. That bridge wasn't launching missiles at anyone. It was keeping Iran's economy breathing under sanctions. The United States hit it anyway, sending an unmistakable message about exactly how far Washington was now willing to go to squeeze Tehran's ability to function economically while it continued fighting. Layer onto that the Strait of Hormuz itself, still only carrying a fraction of its pre-war oil volume even months after the initial blockade technically ended, with Gulf neighbors like Saudi Arabia and the UAE actively accelerating permanent pipeline infrastructure specifically designed to bypass Iranian-controlled waters altogether, a long-term structural bet that Iran's greatest source of regional leverage is going to matter measurably less within the next year or two. An economy under that much simultaneous pressure doesn't produce a confident, stable population. It produces exactly the kind of grinding daily desperation that has already, once this year, exploded into the streets. And that brings us to the second pressure, the one that arguably matters most for understanding whether the Mashhad shooting is plausible at all, the sheer scale of domestic anger Iran's own security forces generated against themselves just 7 months before this funeral. In December of 2025, protests broke out among shopkeepers over currency collapse and food shortages, and within days spread to more than 200 cities across the entire country. Iran's government responded, starting January 8, 2026, with what became one of the deadliest crackdowns in the Islamic Republic's modern history. Amnesty International documented security forces, specifically including Revolutionary Guard units and the Basij militia, the same militia whose members were allegedly shot in Mashhad, firing rifles and shotguns loaded with metal pellets directly at protesters' heads and torsos from rooftop positions. Iran's own government put the official death toll at just over 3,000. Independent tracking by Iran International compiled a list running past 6,600 names, with fewer than 100 names overlapping between the 2 counts. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Iran cited medical sources suggesting the true toll could run as high as 20,000. Investigations afterward revealed the crackdown wasn't chaotic panic. It was coordinated, with Human Rights Watch documenting a specific tactic called hunting leaders, where guard agents disguised as protesters identified organizers within crowds and either shot them directly or radioed their location to rooftop snipers. Here's why that matters directly for the Mashhad story. Even in the aftermath of that massacre, evidence emerged of genuine cracks inside the regime's own security apparatus. Security forces documented retreating from specific protest scenes. A law enforcement officer in a Kurdish-majority city telling Time magazine that every officer at his own station privately believed the regime itself was collapsing. Leaked casualty estimates from sources inside the presidential office itself contradicting official government numbers. That is the exact same pattern we're now seeing play out around the Mashhad shooting. Sources inside or adjacent to the regime's own apparatus providing information that contradicts the official narrative, forcing observers to weigh competing claims from within the same institutional structure rather than trusting a single clean account. Iran has now demonstrated, twice within the same 7-month period, that its own internal accounting of politically sensitive violence cannot be taken at face value, whether that violence is committed by the state against its own citizens, or potentially committed by unknown actors against the state's own loyalist militia. The third pressure worth understanding is the armed opposition Iran has been actively fighting on its own soil throughout this summer, because it establishes a genuine, currently active precedent for exactly the kind of targeted violence the Mashhad reports describe. We've covered on this channel how, in the final days of June and into July, gunmen killed 2 Revolutionary Guard members outside their homes in the city of Pave. Separately, 2 police officers were killed and a 3-year-old girl was wounded when gunmen targeted a checkpoint in Bane. Fighters from the East Kurdistan Defense Units, the armed wing of the Kurdish opposition group PJAK, clashed directly with Revolutionary Guard units near Mahabad. An ambush in the village of Kazkapan near Piran-Shahar left 6 Kurdish fighters dead, according to their own party's public statement. In an operation the Revolutionary Guard claimed differently, reporting only 5 bodies with no explanation for the discrepancy. Another example, notably, of Iran's own security apparatus providing casualty figures that don't cleanly match reality. These incidents are spread across more than 200 kilometers of western Iran, and they represent a documented, ongoing pattern of targeted lethal violence against Revolutionary Guard and affiliated security personnel happening throughout this exact period in cities and towns not so different in character from Mashhad. If Kurdish opposition fighters, or fighters from any of the other opposition networks Iran has spent years fighting, have demonstrated the willingness and capability to conduct targeted killings of security personnel in multiple cities across the west of the country this summer, the claim that something similar happened in the northeast, in Mashhad, during a moment of maximum symbolic vulnerability for the regime, is entirely consistent with an already established pattern, not some implausible one-off. So who actually has an incentive to lie here, and about what specifically? It's worth walking through both directions honestly, because neither is implausible given everything else happening inside Iran this year. If the killings did happen, and Fars News is the outlet lying, you have a scenario where the regime desperately wants to suppress any evidence that its own capital-adjacent cities and its own loyalist militia network remain vulnerable to targeted violence during the single week it's trying hardest to look invincible to both its own population and to the outside world. A government obsessed with narrative control, in the middle of trying to stage exactly that kind of unshakable image of strength, surrounded by millions of genuinely grieving mourners and foreign delegations, including one from Saudi Arabia, a country Iran has been at odds with for decades, would have every conceivable reason to bury a story like that as fast and as quietly as possible, because it directly undermines the entire purpose of the ceremony, projecting strength and continuity at the exact moment both are most in doubt. But if the killings didn't happen and Sabri News fabricated or badly mishandled the story, that points towards something almost equally revealing about the state of the regime right now. A security and information apparatus so fractured internally that 2 outlets under the exact same institutional umbrella, both explicitly affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, can't even coordinate a consistent story about what did or didn't happen on the ground during the 1 week they most needed message discipline. Either explanation requires you to accept that something inside Iran's security and propaganda machinery is functioning worse than the carefully choreographed funeral footage wants you to believe. Either version of the truth here tells you the same underlying thing, and I think this is the part worth sitting with longest. Whatever the reality of those 2 bodies in Mashhad, the Islamic Republic staged its most important public ceremony in over 3 decades under conditions of profound internal uncertainty. A supreme leader who hasn't spoken publicly in 4 months, not even a recorded audio message to mark his own father's death. A security apparatus that can't agree on its own casualty reports within a single day of an alleged incident. A war reigniting in real time along its southern coast, with fresh civilian and military casualties from American strikes piling up in the same week. An economy being squeezed simultaneously through reimposed oil sanctions and a direct strike on its own critical trade infrastructure. An active, ongoing insurgency in its western provinces that has already killed multiple Revolutionary Guard and police personnel this summer using exactly the kind of tactics the Mashhad reports describe. And a population it had just spent this past January violently suppressing in a nationwide crackdown that killed somewhere between 3,000 and 20,000 of its own citizens, depending on which source you believe, a discrepancy in official versus independent death tolls that itself echoes exactly the same pattern of confusion we're now seeing around the Mashhad shooting. A regime that, confident in its own stability, doesn't need 6 days of armored funeral processions, closed national airspace, and metal detectors at a religious ceremony. It doesn't need 2 competing Revolutionary Guard-linked outlets scrambling, in real time, to control a single local news story about 2 dead militiamen in a provincial city. The sheer scale of the security operation around this funeral and the visible confusion inside Iran's own propaganda machine about what actually happened during it tell you more about the fragility underneath the Islamic Republic right now than any single confirmed casualty count from Mashhad ever could on its own. What happens next matters enormously, both for understanding Iran's internal stability and for understanding where this broader war goes from here. If Mojtaba Khamenei's continued public absence stretches on much longer, past his own father's funeral, past the collapse of the ceasefire, questions about who is actually making decisions inside Iran right now, questions already being asked openly by regional analysts and Western intelligence assessments alike, are only going to intensify. If Iran's Western insurgency continues spreading, and its own Revolutionary Guard continues absorbing casualties from Kurdish opposition fighters in one province, while simultaneously managing contested killings in another, the picture of a security apparatus stretched dangerously thin across multiple simultaneous fronts becomes harder and harder for Tehran to paper over with funeral footage and defiant social media posts. And if more contested, unconfirmed casualty reports keep surfacing from inside Iran, each one met with denial from a different arm of the same security state, the outside world is going to have an increasingly difficult time distinguishing genuine internal unrest from confusion, propaganda or simple institutional dysfunction, which may, in the end, be exactly the kind of fog Tehran needs right now to buy itself time while it fights fires on every single front at once. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments which version of the Mashhad story you believe actually happened, because I'll be back the moment we get real clarity on this.